The Ukrainian decathlete Volodymyr Androshchuk has been buried in western Ukraine. He was struck in the head by shrapnel last week while fighting Russian forces near Bakhmut, the current epicenter of the conflict. The 22-year-old was a national youth champion. His death has intensified calls for the International Olympic Committee not to allow Russian and Belarusian athletes at next year's Paris Games.
Decathlete Volodymyr Androshchuk was one of Ukraine's most promising sportsmen. He died in combat last week. As a member of the national team, he didn't have to fight in the war, but he chose to. A young life, once full of hope for the Paris Olympics, cut short. Vova was a very talented sportsman. He had the perfect character for sports. He had everything to be successful in training and in competitions. There's sadness but also anger here at what these people see as a grave injustice. Why should Russians and Belarusians get to compete in Paris when many Ukrainians can't because of the death and destruction? Ukraine says 340 sports facilities have been damaged or ruined since the war began. A boycott of the Games has been mooted unless the International Olympic Committee changes course. Its president, Thomas Bach, personally called out by one of Ukraine's biggest sports stars.
You propose to authorize Russian and Belarusian athletes to participate in the Paris Games. I tell you, the Russians are Olympic champions in crimes against civilians. They have the gold medal in deportation of children and rape of women. You cannot put your Olympic emblem on these crimes because you will be an accomplice with this abominable war.
The IOC called Klitschko's statement defamatory. It says its mission is to bring all athletes together in the name of peace. Only now, that mission won't include Volodymyr Androshchuk. One more victim of Russia's war.
Poland's sports minister says as many as 40 countries could boycott the 2024 Paris Olympics if Russia and Belarus take part. The International Committee is considering allowing Russian and Belarusian athletes to participate, but only under a neutral flag. It says nobody should be prevented from competing because of their nationality and insists a boycott would only punish the athletes. For more on the question of Russia's Olympic participation, Jonathan Crane from DW Sports joins us. Jonathan, tell us a bit more about what Poland's sports minister has said, first of all.
Yeah, the sports minister, Kamil Bortniczuk, really not mincing his words, Ben. He's essentially saying it's inconceivable that Russian and Belarusian athletes should be allowed to compete in Paris when Russia is waging a violent war in Ukraine, killing thousands of civilians, including, of course, athletes. He also mentioned this idea that if Russians were allowed to compete, it would legitimise Russia's actions and give President Vladimir Putin a propaganda boost. We've seen in the past how Putin kind of uses athletes to promote himself and his regime and his politics. So he's trying to work on this coalition. He mentions 40 countries. That's a significant number. It's unclear, really, how many he has actually spoken to. But if enough countries take part, he says, then it would kind of make hosting the Games pointless. Now, we know, for example, the UK, that was one of the countries Bortniczuk mentioned, has criticised the plans. But another, the US, has kind of sided with the International Olympic Committee. Let's take a listen.
In cases where sports organizations and event organizers, such as the International Olympic Committee, choose to permit athletes from Russia and Belarus to participate in supporting events, it should be absolutely clear that they are not representing the Russian or Belarusian states. And so that's the stance that we are providing, and the use of official state Russian Belarusian flags, emblems, and anthems should be prohibited as well.
What about the IOC's response?
Well, this growing criticism really has put the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, on the defensive. Last night, it released a Q&A document. I counted 24 questions and answers in total, kind of rebutting some of these accusations. The first thing it says that speculation about a participation or possible participation of Russian and Belarusian athletes is premature. Slightly strange, considering the IOC was the one that opened the door to that participation. Concerning the boycott, it says a boycott would go against its values, against the Olympic Charter, adding, it is extremely regretful to escalate this discussion with a threat of a boycott at this premature stage, there's that word again, as history has shown previous boycotts did not achieve their political ends and served only to punish the athletes of the boycotting NOCs, NOCs being National Olympic Committees of the countries. The IOC also reiterated its mission to kind of unite the world in peaceful competition. It cited 2 UN experts on human rights saying that no athlete should be discriminated against because of their passport.
So how do you think this is all going to play out?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? And I think some people might be asking, why are we even having this discussion now? The Paris Olympics are 18 months away, but qualifying events for those games are already getting underway. Now, under normal circumstances, Russians and Belarusians would compete in European qualifying events. But given the war and its proximity in Europe, I think there'd be a lot of resistance from European countries hosting those events. One possible workaround is that the Asian Council, the Olympic Council of Asia, has offered Russians and Belarusians a chance to compete in Asian qualifying events, such as the Asian Games. But once we do get to Paris, ultimately it's the sports federations, individual sports decide whether Russians and Belarusians can compete in those events. And as we've seen in the past, though, with the Russian doping scandal, remember, big calls for Russia to be banned completely didn't happen. The IOC usually finds a way of getting its way, even if that means them competing as neutrals.
Jonathan Crane from DW Sports, thank you very much for bringing us up to date on that intriguing story.
You're welcome.